Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Tombstone, Arizona. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1905, and Tombstone had already established itself as a place of legend and infamy. While the town had grown beyond its Wild West days following the silver boom of the 1880s, the shadows of its violent past still lingered in the collective memory of its residents. Yet, what transpired at the Miller estate would cast a different kind of darkness over the desert town, one that would haunt its residents for generations to come. The Miller family had arrived in Tombstone in 1898, having purchased a sprawling property on the outskirts of town, approximately 3 miles east along the Charleston Road. The estate sat nestled against the foothills, partially obscured by a grove of cottonwood trees that seemed out of place in the arid landscape. The main house was a Victorian structure, imposing yet elegant, with a wraparound porch and numerous windows that reflected the harsh Arizona sun during the day and remained disconcertingly dark at night. According to county records, Edward Miller was a retired railroad executive from Chicago who had amassed a considerable fortune through various investments. His wife, Eleanor, was described in the limited social notices of the Tombstone epitaph as reserved but gracious, though she rarely attended community functions. They arrived with their adult son Thomas, who was said to be recovering from an unspecified ailment contracted during his studies at an Eastern university. The household was completed by 2 servants, a housekeeper, Mrs. Abigail Winters, and a groundskeeper, Mr. James Peterson. For nearly 7 years, the Millers maintained what appeared to be a quiet existence on their estate. They were not unfriendly, but neither did they integrate fully into Tombstone society. Edward Miller occasionally conducted business in town and made charitable donations to the local school and church, which earned him a reputation as a respected, if somewhat distant, member of the community. Eleanor was occasionally seen at the local mercantile, always impeccably dressed in the latest Eastern fashions, purchasing fabrics and household goods of the finest quality. Thomas was rarely seen in town, though occasionally townspeople reported glimpsing him riding alone in the surrounding hills, a solitary figure against the desert landscape. What few people knew was that Edward Miller had specifically chosen Tombstone for its isolation and distance from Chicago. According to documents later discovered in the archives of his former employer, the Illinois Central Railroad, Miller had retired suddenly following a series of controversial business decisions that had earned him powerful enemies. While never formally accused of wrongdoing, correspondence between railroad executives suggested that Miller had narrowly avoided a scandal involving manipulation of land purchases along proposed railroads. It was on March 17, 1905, that Sheriff William Morris received a visit from Mr. Peterson, the Miller family's groundskeeper. According to the sheriff's log, Peterson appeared agitated and pale as he reported that he had not seen any member of the family for 3 days. Initially, this might not have seemed cause for alarm, but Peterson insisted that it was highly unusual, particularly since Mrs. Miller had arranged to meet with him regarding plans for the spring garden, an appointment she had never missed in all his years of service. Peterson's statement, preserved in the county records, noted other troubling details. The family's horses remained in the stables, their carriage untouched. No arrangements had been made for extended absence, which Mrs. Miller was known to do meticulously whenever the family traveled. Most concerning, Peterson had observed that the lamps in Edward Miller's study had burned continuously for 2 nights, visible through the windows, yet his knocks at the door went unanswered. What the sheriff discovered upon visiting the estate that afternoon would become the foundation of one of Tombstone's most disturbing mysteries, a mystery that, despite numerous investigations spanning over 6 decades, would never be conclusively solved. The Miller estate stood in perfect order that day. The gravel driveway was neatly raked, the brass fixtures on the front door polished to a high shine. Nothing in the exterior appearance of the property suggested anything amiss. Yet when Sheriff Morris knocked on the door, his knocks echoed unanswered. After several attempts, and with growing concern, the sheriff decided to enter the premises. The front door was unlocked, which Peterson confirmed was unusual, as Mrs. Miller was fastidious about security. The interior of the house was immaculate, not a cushion out of place, not a speck of dust visible on the polished furniture. The dining table was set for breakfast with fine china and silverware, the food untouched, but long since spoiled. A fire had burned down to cold ashes in the main fireplace, suggesting it had been lit but not tended for days. In the kitchen, a kettle sat on the cold stove, filled with evaporated water that had left a mineral ring around its interior. A loaf of bread on the cutting board had hardened to stone, a knife resting beside it, as if the simple act of preparing a meal had been suddenly interrupted. According to Sheriff Morris's report, what struck him most profoundly was not what he found, but what he didn't find. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and most disturbingly, no trace of the Miller family. Edward, Eleanor, and Thomas Miller had vanished without apparent explanation, leaving behind all their possessions, including Edward's pocket watch, described as his constant companion, which rested on his bedside table. In the master bedroom, Eleanor's jewelry box remained filled with valuable pieces, including an emerald necklace that Peterson identified as an anniversary gift from Edward that she treasured greatly. Her clothing hung in orderly rows in the wardrobe, her personal toiletries arranged with precision on her vanity table. The bed was made with hospital corners, the coverlet smooth and unwrinkled. Thomas's room presented a similar picture of abandoned routine. Books sat open on his desk beside carefully taken notes, suggesting ongoing study. His wardrobe contained full sets of clothing, from everyday wear to formal attire. Nothing suggested preparation for travel or hasty departure. In the days that followed, Sheriff Morris organized a thorough search of the property and surrounding areas. Volunteers from town combed the nearby desert and hills. Telegrams were sent to neighboring counties and to Edward Miller's known associates in Chicago. The Tombstone epitaph ran daily updates on the case, which quickly captured the attention of newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The absence of the Millers was puzzling enough, but what truly unsettled investigators were the small details that didn't align with a typical disappearance. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, who had been visiting her sister in Bisbee during the incident, noted upon her return that while everything appeared orderly, certain things were not right. Eleanor's prized silver hairbrush remained on her vanity, but her collection of hairpins, which she meticulously arranged each evening, was scattered as if in haste. Thomas's room contained all his clothing and personal effects, yet the leather-bound journal he wrote in daily was missing, while its ornate brass key remained in the locked drawer of his desk. Mrs. Winters also noted another troubling inconsistency. The silver letter opener that usually sat on Edward's desk was found instead on the floor of the upstairs hallway, partially hidden beneath a runner carpet. When questioned why this seemed significant, Mrs. Winters explained that Mr. Miller was extraordinarily particular about his desk implements and would never have removed the opener from its designated place beside his blotter. Most peculiar was the state of Edward Miller's study. Known for his meticulous organization, his desk was found with drawers partially open, papers seemingly sorted through. Yet nothing appeared to be missing, and his safe remained locked and undisturbed, with all valuables accounted for. As Mrs. Winters reportedly told Sheriff Morris, it was as if someone had been looking for something specific, something that wasn't money or jewels. The ledgers and account books in the desk revealed that the family's financial affairs were in perfect order. Edward Miller had substantial deposits in the Tombstone Bank, as well as investments in various enterprises across the territory, and back east. There were no indications of financial distress or unusual withdrawals. In fact, according to the bank records examined by Sheriff Morris, Edward had recently increased his charitable contributions to the town, funding the construction of a new wing for the small local hospital. As weeks passed without any sign of the family, theories began to circulate through Tombstone. Some suggested financial troubles, despite the apparent affluence of the Millers. Others whispered about Edward's railroad connections and the possibility of enemies from his business days. The more sensationally inclined pointed to Thomas's mysterious illness and speculated about mental instability. Yet none of these theories adequately explained the circumstances of their disappearance. There had been no unusual withdrawals from the Millers' accounts at the Tombstone Bank. No suspicious characters had been observed near the property in the days leading up to the incident. The family had not mentioned any travel plans to their servants or acquaintances in town. Sheriff Morris interviewed the few townspeople who had interacted with the Millers in the days before their disappearance. The clerk at the Mercantile recalled that Eleanor had purchased an unusual quantity of medical supplies, bandages, alcohol, and iodine, citing the need to replenish the household first aid kit. The postmaster mentioned that Edward had been receiving an increasing number of letters from a correspondent in Philadelphia, the last arriving just days before the disappearance. It was as if the Millers had simply vanished into the thin desert air, leaving behind a perfectly preserved tableau of interrupted lives. The investigation might have remained at this impasse were it not for the discovery made 6 weeks after the disappearance. A prospector named Harlan Reeves, searching for mineral deposits in the foothills approximately 2 miles from the Miller estate, came across a peculiar arrangement of rocks in a small ravine. What caught his attention was not the rocks themselves, but what lay beneath them. A man's leather glove, finely made and monogrammed with the initials E.M. Reeves, recognizing the potential significance of his find, brought the glove directly to Sheriff Morris. The sheriff confirmed with Mrs. Winters that the glove indeed belonged to Edward Miller, identifying it as part of a pair he had ordered from a craftsman in St. Louis the previous year. Sheriff Morris immediately organized a more intensive search of the area. What they found over the next 3 days added layers of confusion to the already perplexing case. A trail of small personal items belonging to the Millers created a meandering path through the foothills. Eleanor's silver locket containing a portrait of her husband, a monogrammed handkerchief belonging to Thomas, Edward's distinctive gold cufflinks, said to be a gift from a railroad baron. These items were found at irregular intervals, seemingly dropped or placed deliberately, creating a trail leading deeper into the rugged landscape. What made the discovery all the more baffling was the condition of these items. Despite having been exposed to the elements for weeks, they showed minimal weathering. The silver locket retained its polish. The handkerchief was relatively clean, despite having been found partially tucked beneath a rock. This suggested to investigators that the items had been placed there recently, not at the time of the family's disappearance. The search party followed this trail to a small box canyon, where it abruptly ended. Despite extensive efforts, including bringing in trackers from the nearby San Carlos Apache Reservation, no further trace of the Millers was found. The canyon itself revealed nothing unusual, no disturbed earth suggesting burial sites, no caves or mine shafts where bodies might have been concealed. One of the Apache trackers, a man named Nashota, according to Sheriff Morris's notes, stated something that was initially dismissed but would later take on greater significance. Examining the area where the cufflinks were found, Nashota told the sheriff that the ground felt wrong and that no animal would walk here. When pressed for clarification, the tracker could only say that there was an emptiness to the place that troubled him. The sheriff, a practical man with little patience for what he considered superstition, made note of the comment but gave it little weight. In his official report dated May 12, 1905, Sheriff Morris wrote, "It is my reluctant conclusion that the trail of personal effects was deliberately created to mislead investigators. Whether by the Millers themselves or by parties responsible for their disappearance remains unclear. The absence of any human remains or signs of violence leaves this office unable to determine whether a crime has been committed, despite the troubling circumstances. The case of the Miller family might have faded into obscurity, becoming merely another unsolved mystery in a town that had seen its share of violence and unexplained events. However, what transpired in the months and years following their disappearance would ensure that the Miller estate became a persistent source of unease in Tombstone's collective memory. By the autumn of 1905, with no resolution to the case, the Miller property was placed in legal limbo. With no relatives coming forward to claim the estate and no evidence to declare the family deceased, the property remained unoccupied, but maintained through a trust established by Edward Miller's attorneys in Chicago. Mrs. Winters and Mr. Peterson were retained to provide basic upkeep, though both refused to stay in the house overnight, a reluctance they struggled to articulate when questioned. It was Mrs. Winters who first reported the unusual occurrences at the property. In October 1905, while cleaning the main parlor, she noticed that a photograph of the family had been moved from its usual position on the mantelpiece to Edward's desk in his study. Assuming Mr. Peterson had moved it while dusting, she thought little of it until she mentioned it to him, and he denied having touched the photograph. Over the subsequent weeks, both servants reported small disturbances throughout the house. Items moved from their usual positions, doors found open that had been closed, the distinct sound of footsteps on the upper floor when no one was present. These accounts might have been dismissed as the imaginings of anxious minds, had they not been corroborated by Sheriff Morris himself. In his personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1921, Morris recounted a visit to the Miller estate in December 1905. "I conducted another inspection of the property today, still hoping for some overlooked clue. While examining the library, I distinctly heard the sound of a piano from the parlor, though I was certain I was alone in the house. Upon investigation, I found the piano untouched, the parlor empty and cold. I am not a superstitious man, but I confess the experience left me deeply unsettled." Morris's journal contained other entries regarding the Miller case, revealing a man increasingly troubled by his inability to resolve the mystery. In one passage dated January 1906, he wrote, "I am plagued by dreams of the Miller boy, Thomas. Though I never met him in life, his face appears to me in sleep, watching from doorways or windows. I know this to be merely the product of an overactive mind, yet the dreams persist with disturbing clarity." By 1906, rumors about the Miller estate had begun to circulate widely in Tombstone. Children avoided the property on their way to and from school. Adults spoke in hushed tones about lights seen in the windows late at night, though the house remained officially unoccupied. When a fire broke out in the stables in March of that year, destroying the structure completely, many in town viewed it not as an accident, but as an ominous development in an already disturbing narrative. The local newspaper reported that the fire had started under peculiar circumstances, with multiple witnesses claiming the blaze began simultaneously in different areas of the structure. The volunteer fire brigade managed to prevent the flames from spreading to the main house, but the stable was reduced to ashes. Among the charred remains, firefighters discovered a pocket watch that Mrs. Winters identified as belonging to Thomas Miller, though she could not explain how it came to be in the stables when she had never seen it there during her regular cleaning. The fire brought renewed attention to the property and the unresolved case of the missing family. Augustus Blackwood, a private investigator from Denver with a reputation for solving difficult cases, arrived in Tombstone in April 1906 at the behest of Edward Miller's former business partner. Blackwood's approach to the investigation differed significantly from Sheriff Morris's earlier efforts. Rather than focusing solely on the disappearance itself, Blackwood delved deeply into the background of the Miller family. He traveled to Chicago, Boston, and New York, tracing the family's history through public records, interviews with associates, and examination of Edward's business dealings. What he uncovered would add a troubling dimension to the mystery. According to Blackwood's notes, preserved in the archives of the Arizona Historical Society, Edward Miller's railroad career was not as unblemished as it appeared. There were suggestions of involvement in land speculation schemes that had ruined several small farmers along planned railroad routes. More disturbing were the references to Edward's reputation among former colleagues as a man with unusual methods of handling opposition. One former business associate of Edwards, speaking to Blackwood under condition of anonymity, recounted an incident in which a journalist investigating the railroad's land acquisition practices suddenly abandoned his story and left Chicago after a private meeting with Miller. The associate speculated that Edward had either bribed or threatened the man, though no evidence existed to support either claim. Eleanor Miller, it emerged, came from a wealthy Boston family with its own shadows. Before her marriage, she had been briefly committed to a private sanatorium following what was described only as an incident at a family estate in Vermont. The details of this incident were carefully obscured in the records Blackwood accessed, but he noted that her release coincided with a substantial donation from her father to the institution. Through persistent investigation, Blackwood managed to locate and interview a former nurse from the sanatorium who remembered Eleanor. According to this woman's account, Eleanor had been admitted after becoming convinced that someone was living in the walls of her family home. She had reportedly taken to carrying a small silver knife for protection and had been found one night tearing at the wallpaper in her bedroom, claiming she could hear breathing behind it. The nurse recalled that Eleanor had responded well to treatment and had seemed fully recovered by the time of her release. Perhaps most significant were Blackwood's discoveries about Thomas Miller. Far from being a sickly student, Thomas had been dismissed from Harvard University following allegations of concerning behavior involving a collection of anatomical specimens he had apparently been assembling in his dormitory. While no formal charges were filed, the university had required his withdrawal and psychiatric evaluation. Blackwood's investigative tenacity led him to a former classmate of Thomas who provided a more nuanced picture. This individual, who had become a practicing physician in Boston, described Thomas as brilliant but troubled, with an intense interest in neurological disorders that went beyond academic curiosity. Thomas had allegedly developed theories about the physical basis of mental illness that his professors had dismissed as both unscientific and potentially dangerous, involving techniques for reaching the deeper brain through various forms of physical intervention. These revelations painted a more complex picture of the Miller family than the respectable facade they had presented in Tombstone. However, they still offered no clear explanation for the family's disappearance or the strange occurrences at the estate. Blackwood's investigation took an unexpected turn when he interviewed a former servant of the Millers who had worked briefly for the family during their first year in Tombstone. Maria Gonzalez had been dismissed after less than 6 months of employment, supposedly for breaking a valuable vase. In her account to Blackwood, she described the atmosphere in the house as heavy with unspoken things and spoke of tensions between family members that manifested in long silences and closed doors. Maria told Blackwood that Thomas often worked late into the night in his father's study, the two men speaking in hushed tones that fell silent whenever she approached. She described witnessing an argument between Edward and Eleanor in which Eleanor had become hysterical, shouting that she wouldn't allow it to happen again, before being calmed with some kind of medication administered by Edward. Most intriguingly, she mentioned a room in the east wing of the house that remained perpetually locked. When she inquired about cleaning it, Mrs. Miller had sharply informed her that the room was Mr. Thomas's private study and was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. On one occasion, Maria claimed to have heard strange sounds from behind the door, not voices exactly, but a rhythmic tapping and what she described as a sound like water dripping, but thicker. She also recalled finding unusual stains on linens from Thomas's bedroom, which Eleanor had instructed her to burn rather than wash. When Maria had questioned this, suggesting that lye soap could remove most stains, Eleanor had become unusually agitated, insisting that the linens were contaminated with chemicals from Thomas's scientific work and needed to be destroyed for safety. Blackwood's report indicates that he attempted to locate this room during his examination of the house, but found the layout of the east wing did not correspond to Maria's description. There was no additional room where she had indicated, only a solid wall covered with expensive wallpaper. This discrepancy led Blackwood to wonder if structural changes had been made to the house at some point. With permission from the trust managing the property, Blackwood arranged for a partial removal of the wallpaper and examination of the wall. What the workers discovered was indeed evidence of a former doorway that had been sealed with brick and plaster, then covered with wallpaper that matched the rest of the corridor. According to the contractor who performed the work, the modification appeared to have been done professionally but hastily within the previous few years. Blackwood immediately sought legal permission to open the sealed room. However, before this could be arranged, he was called away from Tombstone by news of his wife's sudden illness in Denver. He departed with plans to return within 2 weeks. He never made it back to Tombstone. According to a brief notice in the Denver Post, Augustus Blackwood was found dead in his home on May 29, 1906, an apparent suicide by poison. The article mentioned that Blackwood had been behaving erratically since his return from Arizona, speaking of being followed and claiming to have received threatening notes. No such notes were found among his effects, and his death was officially ruled a suicide driven by mental breakdown. What the newspaper account failed to mention, but was later revealed through correspondence between Sheriff Morris and Denver authorities, was the state of Blackwood's home when his body was discovered. His case notes had been scattered across his office, many pages missing. Most disturbingly, a message had been scrawled across his office wall, reportedly in Blackwood's own handwriting. "The Millers are not gone." Denver police attributed this to Blackwood's deteriorating mental state, but Sheriff Morris was troubled by the coincidence. In a letter to the Denver police chief, preserved in the county archives, Morris wrote, "Mr. Blackwood struck me as a man of exceptional mental stability and professional detachment. That he should suffer such a dramatic decline following his investigation of the Miller case strikes me as highly suspicious. His unfinished investigation of the Miller case was filed away, the sealed room in the East Wing left unexplored. The trust managing the property denied subsequent requests to examine it, citing concerns about structural integrity. For the next several years, the Miller estate stood empty save for the regular maintenance visits by Mrs. Winters and Mr. Peterson. The strange occurrences continued. Unexplained sounds, items moved, fleeting glimpses of figures in windows, but these reports were increasingly dismissed by town authorities as superstitious nonsense. Tombstone had real concerns to deal with as economic conditions fluctuated and the character of the town continued to evolve away from its frontier origins. Mrs. Winters's journal, discovered after her death in 1918 and now held by her granddaughter, contained numerous entries describing her experiences at the Miller estate. One particularly vivid account from July 1907 detailed her discovery of wet footprints leading from the main bathroom to Thomas's bedroom, despite the house having been empty for days. Another entry described the overwhelming smell of Eleanor's distinctive French perfume suddenly filling the parlor, though the bottle remained unopened on her vanity. Mr. Peterson's experiences were more auditory in nature. He reported to Sheriff Morris on multiple occasions that, while tending the grounds, he would hear the sound of Thomas's piano playing drifting from the house, though upon investigation, the piano would be silent, the house empty. On one occasion, Peterson claimed to have heard a woman scream from the direction of the sealed room, so piercing that he dropped his gardening tools and ran to investigate, only to find the corridor silent and undisturbed. It wasn't until 1912 that the Miller case resurfaced in public attention. A young journalist named Robert Hayes, working for the Arizona Daily Star in Tucson, became fascinated with the unresolved disappearance and began researching it for a feature article. His investigation led him to a discovery that had been overlooked in the original case: a series of letters between Edward Miller and a Dr. Samuel Holcomb of Philadelphia, found in a compartment of Miller's desk that had initially been assumed to be decorative rather than functional. The correspondence, spanning from 1897 to early 1905, revealed that Thomas Miller's condition was more specific than the vague ailment previously described. According to Dr. Adams, Holcomb's letters, Thomas suffered from episodes of dissociative behavior following a high fever in his youth. These episodes had apparently worsened during his time at Harvard, contributing to the incident that led to his dismissal. Dr. Holcomb had recommended a regimen of experimental treatments, some involving early applications of electrical therapy and isolation during periods of acute symptoms. Edward Miller's letters expressed increasing concern about his son's condition, noting that the episodes had become more frequent and more difficult to manage since their relocation to Arizona. In a letter dated September 1904, Edward wrote, "Thomas's episodes now last for days rather than hours. During these periods, he speaks of himself in the third person and seems to have no recognition of Eleanor or myself. More troubling still is his fixation on anatomical matters. He has taken to capturing small desert creatures and conducting what he terms investigations in his quarters. We have removed all sharp implements from his access." A later letter from December 1904 contained an even more disturbing passage. Thomas has now turned his scientific curiosities toward human subjects. Last week, Eleanor discovered sketches among his papers depicting procedures that no sane mind could conceive. When confronted, he claimed they were merely theoretical exercises, but the precision of the drawing suggests otherwise. I fear we can no longer manage his condition without more intensive intervention. The final letter in the sequence, dated February 28, 1905, just weeks before the family's disappearance, contained a cryptic passage that Hayes quoted in his article, "Dr. Holcomb, I fear we have reached the limits of conventional intervention. The measures you suggested in your last communication are extreme, but I see no alternative if we are to prevent further deterioration." Eleanor remains opposed, but recent events have begun to sway her perspective. "I have made the necessary preparations as discreetly as possible. God willing, our next correspondence will bring better news of Thomas's condition." Hayes's article, published in July 1912, reignited interest in the Miller case. He proposed a theory that the family had secretly relocated to pursue more intensive treatment for Thomas, perhaps at one of the private sanatoriums known to operate in California or along the eastern seaboard. This theory accounted for the deliberate nature of their disappearance, but failed to explain the strange trail of personal items found in the foothills or the sealed room in the east wing of the house. The article prompted a response from an unexpected source. A physician named Dr. Walter Graves, who had established a practice in Tombstone in 1906, came forward with information he had previously withheld due to concerns about professional confidentiality. According to Dr. Graves, he had been consulted by Edward Miller in January 1905 regarding the acquisition of certain medical supplies and pharmaceutical compounds that were unusual for personal use. Dr. Graves recalled that Miller had been vague about the intended purpose, citing research interests, but had been willing to pay substantially above market price for discretion. The items requested included chloral hydrate, a sedative, various restraining devices described as for transportation of an invalid, and materials for soundproofing a room. Dr. Graves stated that he had declined to provide these items and had suggested Miller consult a specialist in Tucson instead. In his statement to Hayes, later published as a follow-up article, Dr. Graves expressed regret at not having reported this interaction to authorities after the Millers' disappearance. "I convinced myself that patient confidentiality demanded my silence," he was quoted as saying, "but I have been troubled by the memory of Mr. Miller's intensity that day." There was something in his manner that suggested desperation rather than mere scientific inquiry. This new information cast a more disturbing light on the sealed room and on Edward Miller's final letter to Dr. Holcomb. Hayes pursued this angle in a follow-up article, suggesting that the Millers might have attempted some form of home treatment for Thomas, possibly resulting in tragedy. Hayes also uncovered a detail that had been missing from the original investigation. In February 1905, just weeks before the disappearance, Edward Miller had purchased a substantial quantity of quicklime from a supply house in Benson, claiming it was for agricultural purposes. Quicklime, Hayes noted, was commonly used in the disposal of remains, both human and animal, particularly in instances where burial was impractical or when decomposition needed to be accelerated. It was this theory that finally prompted legal action to open the sealed room in the east wing of the Miller estate. On August 10, 1912, in the presence of Sheriff James Wilson, who had succeeded Morris following his retirement, Dr. Graves, Hayes, and representatives from the trust managing the property, workers broke through the brick wall that had sealed the hidden room. What they found inside was both anticlimactic and deeply unsettling. The room, approximately 12 feet square, contained nothing but a narrow bed frame, stripped of any bedding, a small table bolted to the floor, and a chair similarly secured. The walls had indeed been lined with material for soundproofing, layers of thick felt covered with canvas. A single window had been boarded over from the inside, allowing no natural light to enter. Most disturbing were the restraints attached to the bed frame, leather straps reinforced with metal buckles, positioned to secure a person at the wrists, ankles, and across the chest. These restraints showed signs of having been used, with wear marks and staining visible on the leather. The floor of the room had been covered with a thick rubber mat, since dried and cracked with age. When the mat was lifted, investigators discovered a drain in the center of the floor, suggesting the room had been designed to be washed down. There were no personal items, no indications of who might have occupied the room or what might have occurred there. The walls, upon closer examination, bore shallow scratch marks in several places, particularly around the area where the bed would have been positioned. Sheriff Wilson noted in his report that these marks appeared to have been made by fingernails, though he cautioned against drawing definitive conclusions about their origin. Most puzzling was a series of numbers and letters found scratched into the underside of the table: TM 312-5, N37, Dig 38. But you 110 Dig 46. Hayes recognized that the date, March 12, 1905, fell within the period when the Millers had vanished. The remaining figures appeared to be geographical coordinates, pointing to a location in the wilderness approximately 20 miles northeast of Tombstone. Sheriff Wilson's official report described the room as consistent with a crude medical isolation chamber, but noted that without additional evidence, it was impossible to determine whether it had been used for legitimate treatment or for some more nefarious purpose. An expedition to the coordinates found scratched under the table was organized immediately. Sheriff Wilson led a group that included Hayes, Dr. Graves, and several deputies to the remote location, which proved to be a barren stretch of desert marked only by a solitary rock formation. Despite an extensive search of the area, no evidence related to the Miller family was discovered. Hayes's subsequent article was more pointed, describing the room as a prison disguised as a treatment facility, and strongly implying that Thomas Miller had been kept there against his will. He raised the question of whether Edward and Eleanor Miller might have resorted to desperate measures in dealing with their son's condition, possibly resulting in his death and their subsequent flight from Tombstone. The article proposed a theory that captured the public imagination. Thomas, during one of his episodes, had somehow freed himself from his restraints and turned on his parents, perhaps killing them in the process. He had then attempted to cover his actions by creating the false trail of personal items in the foothills, before disappearing into the vast Arizona wilderness. This theory gained traction in the public imagination, but remained speculative. No human remains were ever found on the property despite renewed searches, and no evidence emerged of the Millers establishing new identities elsewhere. The case remained officially unsolved, though interest gradually waned as more pressing matters, including the outbreak of World War I, occupied public attention. The Miller estate continued to stand empty, maintained minimally by the trust, until the economic pressures of the Great Depression finally forced its sale in 1932. The buyer, a retired physician from California named Dr. Victor Reynard, was reportedly untroubled by the property's history, viewing the tales of disappearances and strange occurrences as colorful local folklore rather than cause for concern. Dr. Reynard's tenure at the Miller estate would be brief and would add yet another layer to its disturbing legacy. Having moved in with his wife Margaret in April 1932, by November of that same year, Dr. Reynard was dead, the victim of what was ruled an accidental fall down the main staircase of the house. Margaret Reynard, according to accounts in the Tombstone epitaph, found her husband's body in the early morning hours, though she reported having heard the fall occur sometime after midnight. The circumstances of Dr. Reynard's death contained elements that echoed the Miller mystery. His body was found at the foot of the stairs, yet according to the coroner's report, some of his injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. There were bruising patterns on his wrists that suggested he had been restrained at some point prior to his death, though Margaret Reynard insisted that no such restraints had been used in their household. In her statement to authorities, Mrs. Reynard mentioned that her husband had been increasingly troubled by insomnia since moving into the house, often wandering the halls at night. She attributed his fatal fall to this sleeplessness, perhaps combined with the disorienting effects of the sleeping powders he had begun taking. What she did not initially disclose, but later confided to a neighbor, according to local accounts, was that Dr. Reynard had developed an obsessive interest in the history of the Miller family and the mysterious room in the East Wing. He had reopened the sealed space, setting it up as a study where he spent increasingly long hours reviewing what documentation existed about the case and making extensive notes of his own. According to the neighbor's statement to authorities, Margaret had expressed concern about changes in her husband's behavior in the weeks leading up to his death. He had begun to claim that he could hear Thomas Miller speaking to him at night, providing insights into his condition and treatments. Dr. Reynard reportedly told his wife that he was on the verge of understanding what had happened to the family, and that the answer lay not in the house itself, but in the coordinates found scratched under the table. Following her husband's funeral, Margaret Reynard allowed Sheriff David Cooper to examine Dr. Reynard's study in the formerly sealed room. Among the papers found there was a journal containing increasingly erratic entries. In the final entry, dated the day before his death, Dr. Reynard had written, "TM was correct. The procedure was not a failure, but a success beyond all expectations. The mind can indeed exist independently of the body under certain conditions. I have verified the coordinates and will make the journey tomorrow. If what waits there is what I suspect, medical science will be forever transformed." E.M. was not a monster but a pioneer, though the cost of his discovery was more terrible than he could have imagined. Margaret Reynard left Tombstone within weeks of her husband's funeral, never to return. When interviewed by a reporter from the Tombstone epitaph before her departure, she would say only that the house contained something that changes how men think, and that she had burned all of her husband's research notes as her final act in the property. The house once again stood empty until it was purchased in 1940 by a development company with plans to renovate it as a hotel capitalizing on Tombstone's growing tourist industry. These plans were abandoned when structural surveys revealed extensive damage to the foundation, reportedly due to water infiltration that had gone unaddressed during the property's many periods of vacancy. However, internal company documents, later made public during a lawsuit between the development company's partners, suggested another reason for the project's abandonment. According to a memo from the company's lead architect to its president, dated September 1940, the modifications required to transform the Miller property into a viable hotel would be prohibitively expensive. Moreover, the incidents reported by our survey team, unexplained equipment failures, workers refusing to enter certain areas of the house, the persistent and unidentifiable odor in the East Wing, suggest that the property's reputation may prove an insurmountable obstacle to commercial success. A more candid assessment appeared in a private letter from the same architect to his brother, found among his personal papers after his death. I have been in this business for 25 years and have renovated buildings of every age and condition. Never have I encountered a structure that feels so fundamentally wrong as the Miller house. The proportions of the rooms seem to shift when viewed from different angles. Sound behaves strangely within its walls. Most disturbing is the former treatment room in the East Wing, which our workers refused to enter after two of them experienced identical nightmares following their initial assessment. I have recommended abandonment of the project on technical grounds to spare the company embarrassment, but the truth is that place should be razed to the ground and the earth salted. In 1945, a fire of unknown origin destroyed much of the main structure of the Miller estate. By the time the Tombstone Volunteer Fire Department arrived, the East Wing had been completely consumed, and the fire had spread to most of the main house. Despite their efforts, only a portion of the West Wing could be saved. According to witness accounts, the fire began in the early hours of the morning, with flames first visible in the area of the sealed room in the East Wing. What made the blaze particularly unusual, as noted in the fire chief's report, was its color and intensity. Several firefighters described the flames as burning, with an unnatural bluish tinge, and seemingly resistant to water in the early stages of their efforts. The ruins stood as a bleak landmark for several years before being demolished in 1952 to make way for new development. During the demolition process, workers made a discovery that briefly revived interest in the old Miller case. A metal box found embedded in the mortar of the foundation beneath where the sealed room had stood. The box, heavily damaged by the fire, but still intact, contained a leather-bound journal. The pages were water-damaged and partially burned, making much of the content illegible, but enough remained to identify it as the missing journal of Thomas Miller. The fragments that could be read painted a disturbing picture of his mental state and his relationship with his parents. One partially preserved entry, dated January 1905, read, "Father believes I am not aware of their discussions, but the walls of this house carry voices in strange ways. They speak of new treatments, of isolation, and methods that even Dr. H. considers extreme. Mother weeps at night. I have begun to wonder if my condition is as they describe it, or if perhaps it serves some purpose for them to believe me ill." Another entry, dated February 3, 1905, contained this passage. "I discovered Father's correspondence with Dr. Holcomb today. The treatment they propose is nothing short of barbaric: confinement, electrical stimulation of the brain, surgical intervention if necessary. They speak of me as if I were already gone, a problem to be solved rather than a son to be helped. They do not understand that what they perceive as my illness is actually an awakening to truths they cannot comprehend." A fragment from February 17, 1905, was even more revealing. "The room is prepared now. I have seen it, though they do not know I found the key. The sight of those restraints confirmed what I have long suspected. They do not intend to cure me. They intend to silence what I know. What I have discovered in my research threatens Father's understanding of the world. He calls my insights delusions, my discoveries the product of a diseased mind. But I know the truth. The boundary between mind and body is not as fixed as medical science believes. Consciousness can be transferred, preserved, extended beyond its physical vessel. My experiments with animals have proven this. Father found my notes and called them abominations. He cannot see that I stand at the threshold of the most important discovery in human history. The final readable entry, undated but presumably from early March 1905, consisted of just a few legible words. L'homme hocussum will not allow myself to be confined. I have made preparations. When the moment comes, they will understand too late. The coordinates are the key. What waits there will persist long after this body has failed. These fragments suggested a very different narrative than what had been assumed. The possibility that Thomas Miller had been aware of his parents' intentions regarding the sealed room and had perhaps taken preemptive action of some kind. However, with so much of the journal rendered unreadable and no other evidence available, this alternative version of events remained speculative. A particularly unsettling detail emerged when a handwriting analyst from Tucson examined the journal in 1953. According to her report, the final entries showed subtle but significant differences from earlier pages, suggesting either extreme emotional distress or possibly that someone else had attempted to imitate Thomas's handwriting. This analysis raised the troubling possibility that the final entries might have been fabricated, either by Thomas himself as part of some elaborate deception or by another party altogether. The journal was eventually added to the collection of Miller family artifacts held by the Arizona Historical Society in Tucson, where it remains to this day, a tantalizing but incomplete piece of a puzzle that has never been fully resolved. In the decades since the demolition of the Miller estate, the case has periodically resurfaced in books and articles about unsolved mysteries of the American Southwest. Various theories have been proposed, ranging from the mundane, the family relocated secretly due to financial troubles or threats from Edward's business past, to the extreme, involving elaborate murder scenarios or even supernatural elements. A scholarly article published in the Journal of Western History in 1968 attempted to apply modern forensic psychology to the case, suggesting that Thomas Miller may have suffered from a condition that would today be diagnosed as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The author, Dr. Elizabeth Chambers, proposed that the Millers' actions, including the creation of the sealed room, might have represented desperate but misguided attempts to manage their son's condition at a time when mental health treatment was primitive and often inhumane. Dr. Chambers suggested that Thomas may have experienced a severe psychotic episode, perhaps resulting in violence against his parents, followed by confusion and an attempt to hide what had happened. This would explain the trail of personal items possibly dropped as Thomas fled the scene in a disoriented state. His own fate, whether suicide, accident, or survival in another identity, remained an open question in this scenario. Dr. Chambers noted the tragic irony that the Millers' efforts to keep their son's condition private, likely motivated by social stigma and concern for the family's reputation, ultimately led to far more damaging speculation and the permanent tarnishing of their legacy. Other researchers have focused on the significance of the coordinates found scratched under the table in the sealed room and later mentioned in Thomas's journal. Modern mapping has identified the location as a remote area that, in 1905, would have been several days' journey from Tombstone on horseback. The site today contains nothing but a natural rock formation surrounded by desert scrubland. However, geological surveys conducted in the 1970s revealed something unusual about the location. The rock formation sits directly above an underground water source, creating a rare desert spring that occasionally surfaces during wet years. More intriguingly, the rocks in the area contain unusually high concentrations of certain minerals that can produce electromagnetic anomalies, occasionally interfering with compass readings and, in modern times, electronic equipment. These natural features have led some researchers to speculate that the site may have had significance to Thomas Miller due to its unusual properties. If he was indeed conducting experiments related to consciousness and its relationship to the physical body, as suggested in his journal fragments, Perhaps he believed the unique electromagnetic conditions of the site offered some advantage to his work. In 1985, a team from the University of Arizona's Department of Geological Sciences conducted a more thorough survey of the site as part of a broader study of electromagnetic anomalies in the region. Their report mentioned the Miller connection only in passing, noting local folklore associates this particular formation with a historical disappearance case, adding a layer of superstition to what is fundamentally a natural geological phenomenon. However, it is worth noting that several members of our team reported unusual sensory experiences while working at the site, including auditory hallucinations and a persistent sense of being observed. These experiences, while subjective, were consistent across different individuals and different times of day. The land where the Miller estate once stood has since been developed multiple times, currently hosting a small commercial complex. Yet longtime residents of Tombstone still refer to it as the Miller property, and some claim that employees working in the buildings have reported unusual experiences, cold spots, unexplained sounds, an occasional sense of being watched. The manager of a bookstore that occupied part of the property from 1998 to 2004 reported that staff frequently complained of items moving overnight, though nothing was ever taken. Security cameras installed to catch potential intruders would occasionally malfunction in specific areas of the store, particularly a corner that, according to old property maps, would have aligned with the location of the sealed room in the original house. These modern ghost stories are likely embellishments of a mystery that, at its core, represents something more poignant than supernatural, a family struggling with illness, isolation, and desperate choices in an era that offered few good options for their circumstances. What actually happened to Edward, Eleanor, and Thomas Miller in those early days of March 1905? The most mundane explanation, that they simply chose to disappear and start new lives elsewhere, fails to account for the sealed room, the trail of personal items, and the troubling content of Thomas's journal. A scenario involving violence, whether perpetrated by Thomas during a psychotic episode or by his parents in a treatment gone wrong, seems more consistent with the evidence, but remains unproven in the absence of human remains. The trail of personal items found in the foothills, were they breadcrumbs deliberately left to mislead, evidence of a violent end among the rocks and ravines of the Arizona desert, or perhaps markers along a path that held meaning only to Thomas Miller? And what of Augustus Blackwood, the investigator whose pursuit of the truth apparently led to his own demise? The coordinates that appeared in both the sealed room and in Thomas's journal point to a location that, by all objective measures, contains nothing of significance beyond unusual geological features. Yet it was important enough to be recorded in two separate contexts, and later seemed to obsess Dr. Reynard to the point of either delusion or discovery, depending on how one interprets his final journal entry. These questions remain unanswered, the truth lost to time, like so many secrets of the Old West. What endures is the cautionary tale of the Miller estate, a reminder that beneath the respectable facades of even the most seemingly proper households, currents of fear, desperation, and tragedy may run silent but deep. As for the sealed room with its restraints and drain, its soundproofed walls and absence of light, whether it represented cruel imprisonment or misguided treatment, it stands as a grim monument to the lengths to which ordinary people might go when pushed to their limits by circumstances beyond their understanding or control. In 1962, an elderly man visited the Tombstone courthouse requesting access to the records of the Miller case. According to the clerk who assisted him, the man claimed to have information about the family's fate, but wanted to verify certain details before coming forward. After spending several hours reviewing the files, the man left without providing his name or sharing whatever knowledge he possessed. The clerk described him as well-dressed, educated in his speech, and walking with a slight limp. Some have speculated that this might have been Thomas Miller himself, returning in his old age to the scene of whatever transpired in 1905 though this remains pure conjecture. This tantalizing near resolution of the mystery is perhaps fitting for a case that has generated more questions than answers for over a century. The Miller family and their estate have become part of Tombstone's complex tapestry of history and legend, a reminder of the thin line between the factual and the folkloric in a town that has always existed, partly in reality and partly in the mythic imagination of the American West. Perhaps it is fitting that the final word on the Miller case comes not from any official record or investigative conclusion, but from a note reportedly found scratched into the wall behind the wallpaper during the demolition of the house. According to the worker who discovered it, the message read simply, "I am still here." Whether this was an authentic relic of the house's troubled past or merely another embellishment added to an already complex legend, it serves as an appropriate epitaph for a mystery that, more than a century later, remains etched in the collective memory of Tombstone, a town no stranger to violence and tragedy, yet still haunted by the quieter, more insidious horror of the Miller family's fate. The questions continue to echo across the decades. What happened within those walls? Where did the Millers go? And does something of them, somehow, remain? Trapped in the limbo between history and legend, between fact and folklore, between the world of the living and whatever waits beyond. In 2001, during renovation of one of the commercial buildings now standing on the property, workers uncovered a small metal container sealed within a wall cavity. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man, presumably Thomas Miller, standing beside what appeared to be the rock formation at the coordinates mentioned in his journal. The photograph, now in a private collection, bears no date or inscription, offering one final ambiguous piece to a puzzle that may never be complete. In Tombstone, Arizona, where the streets have witnessed their share of gunfights and blood feuds, it is perhaps the silence of the Miller estate that speaks most eloquently of true horror, not the sudden violence of the frontier, but the slow, creeping dread of watching someone you love transform into something you fear, and the terrible choices that such a transformation might demand. As with so many enduring mysteries, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Miller case is not what we know, but what we don't, the gaps where our imaginations insert possibilities that may be far worse than whatever truth lies buried beneath the desert sand.